Flight 965 was used almost exclusively by families, tourists, and businessmen who wanted to return to Colombia to spend Christmas. The takeoff had been delayed almost half an hour due to a winter storm that had entered the northwest of the United States. For that reason, the plane departed from Gate 33 of Miami Airport around 17-14 hours and headed to runway 27. There, the air traffic problems caused by the storm delayed it almost 2 more hours. A crucial deadline, as this forced the last and fatal stage of the trip to be done at night when it should have been during the day. Under normal visibility, the impending disaster could have been prevented, but let's not jump to conclusions. Statistically speaking, air travel is the safest means of transportation, but like any human activity, there can be errors. When plans fail and instruments do not respond as they should, real tragedies occur, like the case today. How can it be that 2 pilots lose the course of a trajectory they often perform? Is it true that this was the worst case of an air accident recorded in Colombia? If there were 150 fatalities, how could it be that 5 people survived? What did they do differently? Who was to blame for all this? Well, to find out the answers, we're going to go back to December 20th of 1995, the day the tragedy of Flight 965 occurred. Flight 965 was a model developed in the 1970s. It was intended to replace the successful Boeing 727 to cover medium and long distance routes, with its main advantage being fuel efficiency. At 47 meters in length and a wingspan of 38 meters, it was a robust aircraft capable of carrying between 200 and 239 passengers, equipped with 2 Rolls-Royce RB211 engines. It was prepared to fly in complex conditions and maneuver with ease. Despite its size, it had a range of 7,000 kilometers and was more than capable of covering the Miami-Cali route. Its navigation system was very advanced for the time. It could, among other advantages, program automatic routes, a great innovation that would, paradoxically, be the cause of the tragedy. Until that December of 1995, this model had never suffered a significant accident. But things were about to change. Flight 965 departed from Miami International Airport, Florida, and arrived at Alfonso Bonilla Aragon International Airport in Cali, Colombia. This journey of roughly 248.549 miles typically takes 3-4 hours based on weather and operational conditions. It was a complex time for aviation in South America, and especially in Colombia. International safety and air control standards were still being implemented in the region. Many airports did not have modern radar and navigation equipment. This meant that the final stages of flights largely depended on the skills of the pilots. And this was complicated because the volume of flights to Latin America had increased far beyond the operational capacity of the airports. This, in a general sense, but Flight 965 was facing a specific difficulty on that trip. At that time, in 1995, the radars that geographically located air traffic for the city of Cali were not working. 3 years earlier, in 1992, they had been damaged by organized crime groups in the context of internal conflicts between guerrillas and drug trafficking, and they had not been repaired all that time. This meant that air traffic controllers depended on the information given to them by the pilots themselves to coordinate traffic and landings. But it was something the pilots knew well and were prepared for. At least that's what was believed. Captain Nicholas Tafuri, aboard the Boeing, was 57 years old and had over 13,000 flight hours. Of all that time, he had completed 2,260 hours in command of the Boeing 757 and 767 models. He was an experienced pilot with that specific model. Tafuri was a Vietnam War veteran and had worked at American Airlines since 1969, meaning he had 25 years of commercial aviation experience. Conversely, the first officer, Donald Williams, 39, had nearly 6,000 flight hours, of which 2,286 were on Boeing models, 757 and 767. Like Captain Tafuri Williams, he served in the United States Air Force between 1979 and 1986, before joining American Airlines in 1986. They were the only Americans on the crew, which also included 6 flight attendants, all highly trained. At 9:30 in the evening, Captain Tafuri reported to the Cali control tower to inform them that they were going to start the landing process. Captain Tafuri informed the passengers that the plane had begun its descent to land in Cali. He described the night as beautiful, with good visibility and pleasant temperature. He also mentioned that they would pass through some showers, but with gentle winds. He thanked the passengers for flying with them and apologized for the flight delay. Finally, he wished everyone happy holidays and a prosperous new year of 1996. He was unaware that his good wishes would not arrive. Everything had been normal on the ground and in the cabin until then. However, that wouldn't be a simple descent. Alfonso Bonilla Aragon International Airport was the second most important in Colombia after El Dorado in Bogota. Located 13.67 miles from Cali in the Cauca Valley, it was relatively hard to reach. Being in a valley, it was surrounded by mountainous terrain, which meant that approaches from the air had to be perfectly controlled. The air navigation infrastructure was limited and relied heavily, as we said, on radio communications. It's worth mentioning that Flight 965 was one of the most advanced at the time, with a navigation system called Flight Management System, which was basically a high-precision autopilot. The flight plan was manually loaded at the time of takeoff and remained active until the final stages of the journey, minutes before landing. It resembled the current global positioning system, but with a single difference, a detail that would ultimately twist things. The automatic navigation required that reference points be marked along the route. The flight plan showed that Flight 965 had to land on runway 01. When Captain Tafuri indicated that they were ready to begin the descent, the air traffic controller responded that it was better to use runway 19. It was more accessible due to the direction they were coming from, and they would make up some of the time they had lost in Miami due to the storm delays. To access runway 19, they had to pass over the airport and make a turn. The controller asked the captain if they were able to perform the maneuver and received an affirmative response. The co-pilot initiated the process, and at this point was when, as discovered in the analysis of the black box, the problems began. The flight plan had changed, and that meant they had to modify the reference points that had been entered in the autopilot instructions. While the co-pilot took over the controls, Captain Tafuri began to enter the new coordinates. As the flight plan was being reset, the co-pilot descended the ship using the aerodynamic brakes. Here, fate dealt the final blow through a combination of human and technological errors. When Captain Tafuri began to input, the reference points for the new route followed the air traffic controller's instructions. The two new points were Tulua and Rosso. The system was supposed to detect only nearby points, and the points were set by pressing an alphabetical keyboard, Ali. By pressing the letter T, the point Tulua was automatically added, but when pressing R, the point entered was not Rosso, but Romeo. It was never established why the computer made that mistake, but the captain did not realize it. He didn't know that he had just instructed the autopilot to head towards the Bogota area where the Romeo point was. That was in the opposite direction to where he was heading. Flight 965, instead of continuing straight to runway 19, began to make a U-turn to the left. Flying in the dark, Nita Furin and Williams noticed the change in course. They fully trusted the flight instruments, but that was a fatal mistake. It was a minute and a half. That was the time it took the pilots to notice the mistake they had made. Immediately, the captain tried to correct the situation, entering the reference points again. The plane then turned in the opposite direction, but they had already started the descent only at the wrong point on the map. They were in a valley surrounded by mountains, very close to Cali. That's when the terrain proximity alarm went off. This alarm was programmed to sound 10 seconds before an impact. And that's how our story comes back to the beginning. A second after the warning, First Officer Williams deactivated the autopilot, and the captain performed an emergency maneuver, trying to dodge the mountain. In the desperation of the moment, neither thought to deactivate the aerodynamic brakes. These brakes made the ascent maneuver much slower. At 9:41 minutes, the nearly 100,000-kilogram Boeing hit some trees on the west side of Buga Mountain. The last flight recorder log indicated that the plane was going 346 kilometers per hour. The impact occurred 17 miles from runway 19, where the plane should have landed. The aircraft skidded across the terrain, tearing out trees and bouncing off rocks. At a certain point, it split in half, and the nose of the plane buried itself near the top of San Jose Hill. On the ground, it was assumed that the flight had had an accident. When they couldn't re-establish radio contact, the problem was that it was impossible to attempt a rescue without having any idea of the possible emergency landing point. It took 12 hours for the authorities to be able to send helicopters to the area and start the search. Meanwhile, in Cali, at the Valle University Hospital, a radio operator from the emergency unit received a message about an incident at Alfonso Bonilla Airport. They couldn't establish contact with a plane that should have landed. At the same time, the relatives of the passengers were at the airport demanding answers upon seeing the empty runway when they had been informed that flight 965 was minutes away from arriving. A paramedic named Perdomo and Dr. Quinterno, the head of emergencies at the university hospital, arrived at the airport in an ambulance, in anticipation that the desperate relatives could suffer a breakdown or cause some violent incident. Meanwhile, the radio operator of the emergency unit was working at the limit of his capacity, trying to find out on his own what had happened, communicating with other operators in the area. He even turned to a contact he had in the guerrilla, who were known to have men stationed in the mountains of Buga. The guerrilla informed him of a crucial detail. They had heard a strong impact hours earlier. Using a map of the area, he contacted the paramedic to tell him that he had a rough idea of where the flight could have crashed. 965. After receiving the location data, Quinterno and Perdomo decided to leave the airport and head at full speed to the accident site. But one of the relatives of the crew members blocked their way and begged them to let him go with them. They had no choice but to accept, and the three of them headed towards the mountains. However, they didn't get far. A few kilometers later, they encountered a security cordon from the army, which didn't let them go any further. They were in a forbidden zone. It was known that the guerrilla had scattered camps throughout the jungle, and the order was not to let any civilian pass to the other side. Frustrated, Quinterno and Perdomo saw more ambulances and fire trucks arrive, but all were stopped. At the university hospital, the radio operator kept communicating with the guerrilla, who eventually said they would allow doctors and emergency services to pass unhindered. That's how the army led the health personnel and firefighters through. They entered the forbidden zone with a military escort. But at a certain point on the road, at the foot of the mountain, the vehicles didn't manage to continue moving forward. They had to continue on foot. While the rescuers were climbing the steep slope, the military set up a checkpoint. The night in the jungle was impenetrable and, without a precise location of the accident, it was useless to try to navigate in the darkness. As terrible as it may seem, they had to wait until morning for the helicopters to be able to sweep the area. As the doctors and firefighters were climbing the mountain, they encountered a person who was slowly descending from the top. At first, they believed it was a local who had reached the plane and was descending to give notice. When they asked him what was the fastest way to reach the summit, the man identified himself as a survivor of the accident. In a hurry and knowing they were needed, the rescuers managed to reach the crash site, where they found 4 other passengers alive. There was also a dog that was traveling in the plane's cargo hold and had survived the impact. When Flight 965 crashed into the mountain, it was known that there were additional survivors. But the low temperatures during the night had caused the death of several of them. One of the rescued died in the hospital 2 days later. The accident was investigated for more than a year to provide details on how and why the aircraft had crashed during a routine maneuver. But the most vivid testimony of what happened that night on board American Airlines Flight 965 came from one of the survivors, Gonzalo Dusan Monroy. Gonzalo Dusan, his wife Nancy Delgado, and their children Gonzalo Jr. 13 and Michelle 6 were traveling to Cali for the year-end holidays. Gonzalo was an accountant who worked at Johnson & Johnson and had not returned to his country for years. He had asked for a few days off and wanted his children to get to know Colombia. The pilot announced they were flying over Barranquilla. Gonzalo got up from his seat to shave and returned a few minutes later. His daughter Michelle was in the window seat, next to her was Nancy, and Gonzalo Jr. was on the left side. There were many empty seats and the boy moved to some places further ahead to be able to look at the landscape. Gonzalo Dusan remembers that they then began to feel a vibration. It was strong but not abnormal on a flight, at least for a few seconds. Then it began to increase. The Bonroys had looked at each other worriedly. Suddenly the lights had gone out. The vibration seemed about to dismantle the plane, and the passengers had started to scream. Gonzalo didn't remember anything about the impact. He had woken up not knowing where he was and with unbearable pain in his back. Then he heard his son's voice asking for help in the darkness. Michelle was screaming for water, her vision impaired. He managed to crawl to the girl. He wanted to lift her, but the little one was trapped. Something was pinning her legs. At daybreak, he spotted an opening leading outside. Nearly frozen, he escaped the plane's wreckage. He could still hear his son's voice, but couldn't locate where he was. He saw two other very injured people lying on the ground talking. He sat next to them, unable to understand their words, only that they complained about the pain. Despite the obvious crash, Gonzalo was in shock and couldn't process the scene before him. He sat for half an hour until he saw a helicopter fly over them. The device stopped for a moment and then left. A few minutes later it returned and dropped a rope down which a rescuer descended. At 1:40 in the afternoon, the University Hospital of the Valley in Cali began to receive the survivors. Gonzalo was the last to arrive. Around 3:30 in the afternoon, he was treated urgently. But as he oriented himself, only one thing worried him. What had happened to his family? The paramedics told him that they had rescued his youngest daughter, Michelle, who was immobilized by a fracture in her left femur. She had suffered a minimal brain edema, superficial wounds, and had nerves from the pelvis to the foot, but miraculously, she was out of danger. Informing him about Gonzalo Jr. was harder. The boy arrived at the hospital alive but unconscious, crying incessantly. Shortly after, he had suffered 2 cardiopulmonary arrests. The second one was fatal. Nancy, his wife, had not survived the crash. Gonzalo had a spinal cord injury at the 7th cervical. He was on the verge of becoming quadriplegic. While he was alive, the pain never left him. The investigation into the tragedy of American Airlines Flight 965 concluded human error. Had they not mistaken the reference point in the first place, the accident would not have occurred. And a calculation derived from the analysis of the black box revealed that if the aerodynamic brakes had been deactivated just 2 seconds before impact, the plane could have risen 40 meters above the slope, where it ended up crashing. Beyond responsibilities, this incident marked a before and after in safety protocols in global aviation. Proximity alarms were calibrated to sound between seconds and a minute before impact, instead of at 10 seconds. Aerodynamic brakes were also modified so that the hand could not be removed from the control until the moment of deactivating them. The name of the reference point, Rosso, was changed to Palma to avoid any future conclusion. For Gonzalo Duzan, the terrible experience charted a future path of faith. Since then, he feels closer to God and finds solace in reading the Bible when memories of the tragedy return to his mind. The dog that was saved from the cargo hold of Flight 965 was named Miracle, perhaps as a simple reminder that behind every hell there is also a glimmer of hope.